Hello and welcome to Middle East Matters. I'm Delon D'Souza. Coming up on the show this week, Recep Tayyip Erdogan firmly in control of the future of Turkish politics after securing yet another term in office. Truffle hunting turns deadly in Syria, the Islamic State group blamed for carrying out a string of attacks. And Lebanon's artistic community gathers for the reopening of the Sursak Museum, destroyed after the port blast in 2020. But first, Recep Tayyip Erdogan will be staying on in Turkey's top job. The president won his re-election bid on Sunday after securing over 52% of the vote in the runoff. Erdogan called for unity after beating Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu. Turkey's opposition, meanwhile, is expected to introspect after winding up in a weakened position. Here's how neighboring Iraq and Syria have been reacting to the news of Erdogan's win.
Here in the northern Syrian city of Afrin, under the control of Turkish-backed rebels since 2018, residents took to the streets to celebrate Recep Tayyip Erdogan's presidential victory. Rising anti-refugee sentiment was one of this election's biggest issues, with nearly 4 million Syrians living in Turkey since the 2012 civil war.
We do not have borders except for those with our brothers in Turkey. Erdogan's success is important for us in the liberated parts of Syria. We hope it's good for the Syrian people. We have family and friends living in Turkey, and we saw many calls by the opposition, Kılıçdaroğlu, to expel them.
However, in his victory speech, Erdogan estimated he'd returned 600,000 refugees to North Syrian safe zones. Further west in Binish, in the rebel-held Idlib province, Erdogan's win is also seen as good news, as the Turkish president has long extended support to the rebels fighting to topple Bashar al-Assad's government.
We saw the Arab countries normalise relations with Assad, and until now Erdogan hasn't softened his stance.
However, it's not the same sentiment on another one of Turkey's borders. Eastwards, in the capital of the autonomous Iraqi Kurdistan region, worries mount about the security implications of Erdogan's win.
I hoped someone else would have been elected instead. We wished for someone who would serve the Kurds' interests, but he only serves the Turks. His hostility towards the Kurds is unprecedented.
For years, the Turkish army has been waging a merciless battle against the Kurdistan Workers' Party separatists, and Ankara classifies them as a terrorist organization.
Iranian journalist Elahe Mohammadi has been tried behind closed doors in Iran. She is one of the two reporters facing charges linked to her coverage of Mahsa Amini's death. The 22-year-old died while in the custody of Iran's morality police. Mohammadi covered Amini's funeral last September, an event which kick-started months of anti-hijab protests in Iran. Elad Mohammadi and Nilufar Hamidi have been accused of colluding with a foreign power, a charge which potentially carries the death penalty in Iran. To Syria next, where a series of attacks have been taking place targeting truffle hunters. Yes, truffles, or sand truffles as they're known, grow in the desert in Syria, and they have become a hot commodity. We can now bring in Mahmoud Naffakh from our Observers team. Mahmoud, how did you first hear about this story?
Well, there's been reports here and there that talk about attacks taking place in the central part of Syria called Badia, the Syrian desert, which is actually a massive zone in Syria that is only inhabited by local Bedouins who go out often from February to April of every year to hunt for truffles. A couple of months ago, 46 members of the Bedouin tribes, of one Bedouin tribes, were shot dead in the head in one incident. So we decided to look closer into this with the Observers teams, and we discovered widespread killings of truffle hunters, of shepherds and their livestock. And now we know that Bashar al-Assad and its army, with their allies from the Russians and the Iranian-backed militias, are active in the desert. But our investigation revealed an activity that was attributed to ISIS cells. So we decided to look even more closer into this, and we found hundreds of videos and images published by the tribes themselves on social media that gave us a clearer picture of what was going on in the Badia. And here is an excerpt of our report that we can watch together.
وهذا الوقت من كل عام هو موسم الكمأة، يعني يجتمع الأهالي من كل المناطق ويذهبون إلى الحماد السوري.
الله أكبر.
بعد الهجمات التي حصلت في الفترة الأخيرة بدأت المجموعات تذهب مع دوريات من الدفاع الوطني.
The NDF, the National Defense Forces, members of the tribes recruited and armed by the Syrian government to help fight the Islamic State group.
القدس ويقومون بحماية المجموعات التي تذهب إلى البادية لجمع الكماء.
طجج يا غانم غانم.
يقومون بأخذ مقابل حمايتهم نصف محصول الكماء الذي يقومون بجمعه في اليوم.
والله لقيت.
فالكماء تظهر على سطح الأرض على شكل تشققات. يقوم جامعي الكماء باستعمال أداة حادة وإخراج الكماء من الأرض، وهذه الطريقة سهلة.
بسم الله ما شاء الله.
الكماء يعني تباع في الأسواق المحلية، تختلف أسعارها.
So Mahmoud, we can see the truffles there. What kind of truffles are we talking about exactly?
So we're talking about desert truffles, which means they are not as strong as their European counterparts, but they're known for their size and their quality. So in Syria, they sell for up to 40 euros a kilo, which constitutes a very handsome revenue for local Bedouins who suffer from 12 years of civil war, which means catastrophic economical condition. So local businessmen with ties to the Syrian regime, they arrange for the authorizations for these Bedouins to go out into the desert, and they arrange as well for their escorts from and by local pro-regime militias, and that's despite the risk that they're facing going out in the desert.
And who's carrying out these?
Well, we are sure that it's the Islamic State now who is doing these attacks. This might come as a surprise because, you know, we think of ISIS as having been dislodged from Syria and Iraq back in 2019, but evidently this does not seem to be the case. ISIS sleeper cells have since taken refuge in the desert and with a different strategy somewhat. Now remember, during its heyday, of course, ISIS claimed responsibility for all the activities and attacks that they did. It was a huge propaganda operation back then. Now, its fighters are keeping a low profile and have become more invisible. So members of the tribes sent us these rare images from the desert that show secret hideaway used by ISIS fighters in the desert in Syria. Let's have a look.
NDF forces regularly patrol the desert. Here they uncover equipment caches, spare parts for motorcycles, medical supplies, and weapons.
So Mahmoud, if these sleeper cells have been reawakened, could we gather that ISIS is making a comeback?
ISIS is not making a comeback, not yet anywhere. There is no suggestion that it will be able to take back territory soon the way they did back in 2015. We're talking about isolated cells. Its fighters actually are biding their time, raising money, recruiting informants, and chipping away at local defenses. Of course, and keeping a low profile most of all, until they believe they are strong enough to go and resume capturing and holding territory in Syria.
Mahmoud, thank you very much for that, Mahmoud Naffakh there from our Observer's Desk. In other news, Lebanon's artistic community came together to celebrate the reopening of the Sursak Museum. The building, as well as several artworks, was severely impacted by the Beirut port explosion in 2020. Now, teams have been working tirelessly to see the site and its renowned collection restored to its former glory. Antonio Carrigan reports.
Nearly 3 years on from the 2020 explosion in the port of Beirut, the Sursak Museum has reopened its doors. A powerful symbol for the Middle Eastern cultural capital.
We're celebrating the return of life to Beirut. Beirut deserves life. Beirut will always be a symbol of culture, and we're really proud that even though it was demolished, we were able to build it again.
I was here the day of the blast to see what happened, and it was, I had tears running down my eyes. Because I run one of the largest art foundations in the region, was very near and dear to my heart.
55 artworks were damaged in the blast, and 70% of the centenarian Ottoman-style building that houses them. The Lebanese government could not fund the €2.5 million restoration, but with help from UNESCO, France, Italy and other private donors, the museum is back in a time of hardship, with 5 new exhibitions. The museum's director sees the restoration as a political message too.
I'm still, like many, angry at our state, and I think that we shouldn't just celebrate, we should show that this is an act of resistance.
Living standards in the country have collapsed and 3/4 of the population now live in poverty. And as for the 202 people killed by the 2020 explosion, justice is yet to be served, and it's a prospect which seems to be growing ever more distant.
That's it for this edition of Middle East Matters. From all of us on team, thank you very much for watching.
Liberté, égalité, actualité.